Welcome to Into the Verse. This is Ari Levison.
And this is Tikva Hecht.
And we're going to be talking to you today about Parshat Vayetze. So Parshat Vayetze, although it deals in the beginning and end with Yaakov's leaving and then coming back to the land of Canaan, really the bulk of the Parsha, in my opinion, is this ongoing struggle between Yaakov and his father-in-law Lavan. Of course, it starts off when Lavan tricks him into marrying the wrong daughter. He ends up having to work for him for 14 years in order to marry the daughters he wants. Then he tricks him out of the sheep, and Yaakov wants to run away. Lavan doesn't let him run away, so Yaakov has to escape in the middle of the night with his whole family, and then Lavan chases after him, and it's this like escalating tension and fight that gets worse and worse until ultimately Lavan catches up to Yaakov, and it blows up in this whole fight. And what I want to talk to you about today is some stuff I noticed that really changed the way I read this whole story about this fight between Yaakov and Lavan.
Wow, that's a big, epic story to have a whole new reframe on. I'm excited to hear it. Where should we start?
Okay, so I promise we're going to get to Parshat Vayetze. We're going to talk all about it. But we're actually going to start somewhere completely unexpected, or unless you're an avid Aleph Beta fan, in which case you know to expect the unexpected. We're going to start in Parshat Mishpatim, in Exodus chapter 21, in this section of like really just random laws, one after another, mostly having to do with damages and the fines you pay for various different damages. Now, if you're a big Into the Verse fan, these laws might sound familiar to you, and that's because we actually dealt with them last year for Parshat Vayigash, and we looked at some fascinating parallels that those laws had to one story. So don't worry, today we're going to talk about something completely different. If you're interested in that, we'll put a link in the description. Let's dig in. These verses begin in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22. V'chinatzu anashim. So two men are fighting. V'nagfu isha hara. And they strike a pregnant woman. So this woman is not part of this fight, just total collateral damage. She's not involved, but they accidentally strike her. V'yatzu yiladaha. And literally what this means is her children come out of her. And for now, let's just leave it with that literal translation. What the fate of these children are is not clear.
Meaning whether the children survive or not.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then the case splits into two possibilities. The first possibility is v'lo yiyeh ason, and there is no tragedy. And the way we generally understand this is it means the death of the mother, this pregnant woman. So she does not die. Anoshi anesh kasher yashit alav bal ha'isha v'natan b'flilim. Basically, he has to pay a fine for the damages that were done. That is if the woman survives this. But verse 23, v'im ason yihya. But if there is this tragedy, if she doesn't survive, v'natatan nefesh tachat nefesh. So you give a soul for a soul. Now, literally, what does that imply, Tikva?
That whoever pushed her would get capital punishment, right? That
Right.
someone who's responsible for her death is then punished by being killed themselves.
Exactly. But when it comes to actually practical law, the way that we traditionally understand this is it doesn't mean literally capital punishment. It actually means you pay a monetary fine in place of that capital punishment, or in place of the soul, which the truth is, I think there's a lot of evidence for how the rabbis understand it that way, and we don't have time to get into that now. But it does leave you with the question of, if it doesn't actually mean capital punishment, why does it say it like this? What does it mean to say a soul for a soul if it doesn't mean literally a soul for a soul? And then why does it go on to continue in verse 24 to say, ayin tachat ayin, shein tachat shein, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, yad tachat yad. And whatever the assailant does should be done to them. Now, we don't actually go poking out eyes if you poke out someone else's eye. But I think this is describing, like, in some kind of ideal divine vision of justice, that, like, at least in theory, if God were enacting these punishments, like, you know, whatever happens to the other person, you deserve for that to happen to you. Practically, that's not how a human court executes justice. But I think that it seems to be reflecting, like, at least in some ideal level, maybe this is what is deserving.
Yeah, it's reflecting some kind of value or reciprocity, which when we actually take that into our practical lives, we kind of account for the fact that I guess in this case it's not intentional. And so we as human beings maybe can't um, execute justice in that 100% reciprocal way. It seems to me like the Torah is trying to balance both the ideal of reciprocity and then the complexity of real life.
Yeah, totally.
Interesting.
So now I want to come back to that language of Vietsu Yeladaha that
Hmm.
we talked about before, that literally her children come out of her. And
Yeah.
traditionally, this is understood to mean she miscarries, which I think makes a lot of sense. But
Hmm.
there's another word that Torah has for miscarry. It's mishakelet. So it's weird that it would use this word viatsu, they come out. To me, that actually doesn't imply that the children die at all. It actually is completely ambiguous. I think you could totally read here that the children survive. But either way, it's just bizarre for the Torah to use this like very technical, like physical word describing them coming out of her, and not a typical word that it would either describe a miscarriage or a successful birth.
Yeah, definitely. It feels like if the Torah wanted us to be really clear about what was going on in this verse, there was a lot of different ways it could have done that, either using more direct language or more direct description. But it feels like it's actually intentionally trying to be ambiguous because otherwise you'd just have an editor in here with a red pen going, wait, this is very, very unclear. So let's
Yeah.
give the Torah the benefit of the doubt and say there's some value to that lack of clarity.
Yeah, Tikva, I think you're totally right. There's so much ambiguity going on in these verses, and I think that's intentional. I think that the Torah is building in many different layers of meaning here. And unfortunately, we only have a short amount of time here on this podcast. And I think for the sake of what we're going to do today, we're just going to have to take one of those layers of meaning and leave, as hard as it is, to leave some of the other possible layers of meaning aside for the time being. But at least the way I want to look at it today is, seeing Vietsuya Ladaha as not meaning a miscarriage, but really leaving this possibility open that the children survive, and to understand it, at least in the traditional way, that ason means the mother, that we're talking about, does the mother die, does she not die?
Hmm. And so I just want to clarify then, in that case, what the fine that comes out of that is this is still a premature birth. This is still where this striking against this woman seems to be leading to her going into labor, probably not when she would have naturally. And that's the crime here, right? There's no damage done. But still, that's emotional damage. We might say that that's not the natural course of events. And so there's still some punishment for that.
Yeah, exactly. According to this understanding, this would mean that even if even if everything is okay at the end of the day and everybody survives, the Torah recognizes that if you cause someone to have this premature birth, there's a lot of trauma and pain that comes with that,
Yeah.
and that you know that deserves to be repaid.
Yeah.
You can't just brush that off as like all's well that ends well. So, truth is, though, I think there is. We've talked about some of the different questions and the weird language of Yetsu here, and why it talks about a soul for a soul. But there's a much broader problem that I think we have to ask when looking at these psukim. Generally, when you want to teach a legal principle, you want to be as simple and straightforward as possible, right? Like, maken nefesh motivat. If you kill someone, you get the capital punishment. That's super clear, super straightforward. You can bullet point it easily. But if I had to ask, like, in a few words, Tikva, like, what is this law? It's the law of blank. 2 words.
Yeah, I'm not sure because it starts off um like if you really are gonna hold me to 2 words, I would say collateral damage. It starts off with these two men fighting and someone else gets hurt from their fight. So it feels like, okay, that's what the Torah wants to teach. But the simplest way to do that is just say they fell down, they got bruised, they hurt, they broke their arm, whatever it is, and then you're teaching that law. Um, they then go to this case where this pregnant woman then has birth. So it seems like you're saying you want to teach the law of if you somehow accidentally, but while two people are fighting, you know, force a woman into early labor. That feels very, very specific. And then it feels very strange at the end that we then go to the woman dying. So it's like, okay, now we're back to collateral damage. I'm not sure if it's trying to teach. Yeah, I'm not sure how to put my finger on it.
Yeah, exactly. Like, if you're trying to teach a case of accidental like, collateral damage, then like why do we have the whole thing with a pregnant woman? If you're trying to teach a
Hmm.
case of what happens if you harm a pregnant woman and all the complications that come with that, why does it matter that it started between a fight between two random other people? And you could go into it more. There's so many details here. And it's like, wow, this feels like it's describing like a really specific and complicated case. And so, Tikva, one thing that we've seen before at Aleph Beta is when you have a section in the Torah about laws, and the laws have all of these super specific, seemingly unnecessary or overcomplicated details, it's a telltale sign that maybe this isn't a hypothetical case after all. Maybe it is.
An actual case. Maybe this is not just a legal principle, but it is case law, and we're responding to an actual case that happened.
Right, indeed. Maybe this is actually telling a story that we've already heard previously in the
Hmm.
Torah. So let's try to figure out what story could this be talking about. Um, and let's try to break down like the elements of this set of laws here and
Okay.
and figure out where we've heard some of these before. So it starts off V'chi netzu anashim, right? When two men are fighting. So, okay, what might that be talking about?
I think there's quite a few. I mean, even starting from Cain and Hevel, there's a lot of fights. So nothing is jumping out to me specifically there.
Yeah. Yeah, unfortunately, the Torah is packed with stories of people fighting, so that doesn't really help us much. So let's turn to the next element of this law, which is you have this
Hmm.
pregnant woman and her child comes out, and there's a possibility, and maybe she actually does die as this child comes out. I think there's only one other story in the Torah where we have something like this at all.
Yeah, women giving birth again, all over that itself. I don't think we can narrow it down so easily. But a woman giving birth and then dying, that would be Rachel. Well, she's giving birth to Benjamin.
Indeed. Right. Rachel,
Interesting.
when
Okay.
she is giving birth to Binyamin, she has this really hard pregnancy, and right after he's born, she passes away. Um, but if we think for a minute also about the backstory to that, right? So on one
Hmm.
hand, right, this death that happens in Genesis 35, and it seems to be this like, isolated thing out of nowhere. But when the rabbis read this, they actually point to something that happened 4 chapters earlier that they say brought about this death, which brings us actually back to the
Interesting.
fight between Yaakov and Lavan. So basically,
Oh,
after 20 years in Lavan's house, see that
a fight
smile coming
between
on
two
Tikva's face.
men. A fight. So we have a fight. We have a pregnant woman, and we have this woman dying in labor. It's starting to feel like the elements are coming together.
Right, so let's catch people up here. So
Okay.
Yaakov and Lavan, right, things were really bad. After 20 years in Lavan's house, he refused to let Yaakov leave, so Yaakov runs away. Um, and eventually Lavan catches up with him, is really upset at him for running away, for taking the whole family. He's like, "Fatignav tet levavi, you've stolen my heart." And he also says, "You've stolen my idols." And
Mm-hmm.
Yaakov, not knowing what Lavan is talking about, says, after everything you've done to me and you chase after me, you don't even let me leave with my family. Now you're accusing me of stealing your idols. And kind of in what I read as just a real kind of explosion of rage, says in Genesis 31, verse 32, "Im asher timtza et Elohecha lo yichya." Whoever you find these idols amongst, they shouldn't live. Right? He puts this
Mm-hmm.
curse of death upon whoever Lavan finds the idols with. Now, what Yaakov doesn't know
Mm-hmm.
is that his wife Rachel, his beloved Rachel, was actually the one who took these idols.
Right.
And although Lavan never actually finds them with her because she manages to conceal them, and that's a whole separate story. As the rabbis understand, Yaakov's words were really binding here, and this
Mm-hmm.
curse, even though it came out of this fit of anger, and maybe he didn't, however much I don't know, he meant it, wanted it to be, wanted it to really come true. He ends up putting this curse on his wife Rachel. But then the curse actually doesn't take effect right away. It's actually not until she's pregnant that this curse kicks into effect. And
Mm-hmm.
her dying in childbirth, which was not very long later, we understand as a result of this curse.
All right, what you're pointing out, it's really resonant with what you're showing us in Shemot. It's also so heartbreaking because we have these two men fighting, and it's as a result from their fighting in their, it's not physical blows, but in their sparring, their verbal sparring, Yaakov says something which is almost like an inadvertent push to someone else, and that person getting pushed is Rachel. And what you're pointing out is that when that push essentially takes effect, it's when she's pregnant, and when she's giving birth to Benjamin is when she actually passes away and feels the full effect of that curse. Um, and so it does feel like when you put all those elements together, again, it's not as immediate, it's not as physical as the case we have in Shemot, but you do have all of those elements: two men fighting, and the collateral damage is Rachel.
Yeah, right. We have, men fighting. We have collateral damage, a pregnant woman who dies giving birth. Really, all of the
Yeah.
elements are there.
It's funny because we were talking about how Shemot, how Exodus seems to be making this case so complicated. But when you point this out, what I'm realizing is Exodus is actually making the case simpler. It's actually showing us here's what happened in a case that was even more complicated and even in a way more abstract or less direct. It's really, really interesting to have that flip of vision there, and all of a sudden be like, oh, Exodus is actually helping us see this story simplified and clearer in a clearer way.
That's a great point. It's like all of a sudden like distilling this case down into like these core elements. It's like a
Mm-hmm.
fight, pregnant woman, childbirth.
Yeah. What's striking me now, though, is the implication is that, yeah, well, someone is responsible in Exodus, right? Someone is punished. And my
Hmm.
assumption was it was the person who hit this woman. Doesn't matter if the two people are fighting. Maybe I'm not reading close enough, but it doesn't matter if the two people are fighting, right? Someone hits this woman and now they get punished. You follow through that algebra. Yaakov is the responsible party. He's the one who, in a sense, actually hits Rachel. So I don't know if that's where you're
Right.
going or relevant, but that
Right.
just strikes me as a little chilling.
Right. And so Tikva, it's interesting because the language it uses when it talks about striking her is actually nagfu, which is
Mm.
plural, which seems to imply that to a certain extent, when two people fight, um, they're kind of both to blame for what happens. Like collateral damage is this really ugly thing that's kind of unavoidable when you have fighting, and it's really like everyone who's involved in the fight is to blame to a certain extent for what happens. But once it switches to the punishment, it goes back into singular. And so it does
Mm.
seem that although to a certain extent maybe both of these parties share some blame, there is one person who is primarily responsible, and as you said, in this case, that seems to be Yaakov. So let's look at that punishment now,
Sure.
and let's look at what it actually says. So wait, remember we said the case splits into two, right? Is there a
Hmm.
son? Does the mother die or does she not die? And of course, sadly, in our case, which one are we dealing with?
We're dealing with a son when she does die.
We're dealing with a
So the
son,
punishment would be
right? She
nefesh
does
tachat
die.
nefesh.
Nefesh tachat nafesh. So, and as we said, right, it doesn't mean you execute the person, but on some level,
Hmm.
what it seems to be describing is whatever the assailant does to this woman gets done back to him, or at least should, in some
Hmm.
ideal world, get done back to him.
Hmm.
So let's think about that, right? Like, so what happens to her, right? We have really two things. Yatsu Yilada, right? Her child leaves her,
Hmm.
and then as a result of that child leaving her, she dies.
Hmm.
So, do we ever have something like that with Yaakov?
With
Does that
Yaakov,
come back to bite him as a punishment?
he does in a sense lose a child. I mean, Yosef ends up being kidnapped. He ends up being abducted, sold into slavery, and he's absent for a number of years. Is that where you're going?
Yeah, so Tikva, look at Genesis chapter 44:28. Um,
Okay.
this is actually, it's Yehuda who is describing to the Egyptian viceroy, who turns out is Yosef, although he doesn't know that.
Hmm.
But he's describing how they wanted to bring Binyamin back to Egypt, like Yosef had wanted them to, and of course Yaakov refuses to let them. And look at the language he uses to describe
Mm-hmm.
losing this one child.
So this is Yehuda talking to Yosef, telling him what his father Yaakov had said to him. ביום עבדך אביא עלינו אתם ידעתם כי שנאים ילדה לי אשתי. Your servant, my father, he said to us, you know that my wife gave birth to 2 sons. ויצא אחד מאיתי, and one of them is gone from me. ואומר אך טרף ולא ראיתי עד הנה. And he was torn by a beast, and I haven't seen him since then. Yehuda is telling Yosef essentially the story of Yosef's own demise, his like fake death through the eyes of Yaakov. Oh, and he says vayetze. It's the same language.
Right.
He's gone out, so he doesn't say explicitly he died.
I mean, I think it actually implies some ambiguity, right? Amar
Yeah.
after Taraf, v'lo re'iti varhena. I said, oh,
Yeah.
he was surely torn by a beast, and I haven't seen him until now. Which to me leaves some possibility of, maybe he's still alive. He's gone. I'm never going to see him
Yeah.
again.
I think you're right. He doesn't want to say he died. He's just saying he had this horrible experience that most of us would assume led to death. But all he's willing to say is, I haven't seen him, and he's gone away from me. He's left me.
Right. And so here is Yaakov, just like the pregnant woman in Mishpatim, and just like Rachel, who gave birth to Binyamin, a child already went out from him. And now what's about to happen is he's afraid about the next child, about Binyamin going out from him. And look back at verse 22 here, what Yehuda says will happen if Binyamin leaves Yaakov, if Yaakov loses Binyamin.
לא אוכל הנער לעזוב את אביו, ועזב את אביו ומת. The boy can't leave his father. If he were to leave his father would die. So our father would die. Yaakov would die. He's basically saying that is death for a child to go out from him. It's Yaakov's own death.
Right.
Yeah.
Child leaves Yaakov, and as a result of child leaving Yaakov, Yaakov would die. It doesn't happen, but here you have this threat, this possibility that this is going to happen. And by the way, who is this child?
This child is Binyamin. This is the child that Rachel gave birth to. So we're essentially seeing Yaakov is in a similar situation to Rachel at that moment. Rachel is giving birth to Binyamin. He's leaving her body, and she is dying from that. And here we have Yaakov, and we know what happens. They have this whole conversation, but ultimately Binyamin does leave. And what you're pointing out is that Binyamin leaving Yaakov's house is like Yaakov is going to die from that.
Right. It's like this perfect Mida Keneged Mida, like what Yaakov caused to happen to Rachel is now about to happen to him. And it seems like it's about to happen until Yehuda steps in and stops fate in its tracks and saves the day. It's interesting if you think about like what the most immediate thing that brought about Yaakov losing his children was. It was actually also a fight.
Yeah, that's true.
And it had
Fight
some
between the brothers.
unintended right, which maybe had some unintended consequences for Yaakov. But the brothers probably didn't mean to hurt him the way they did. And
Yeah.
then if you think backwards, right, because this all started with the fight between Yaakov and Lavan, which really kind of came to a head when Lavan chased after Yaakov. But why was Lavan so mad chasing after Yaakov? It was partly the idols, but there was a much bigger thing that was on his mind, which was
Yaakov had run away with his daughters. And I believe that's what Lavan says. Lavan had lost his children in a sense.
right. Lavan had lost his children. They were taken away from him before he was
Yeah.
ready. He wasn't ready for them to leave him yet. It's almost like Lavan had this like early birth kind of experience too. And then if you keep working backwards and you think, well, what happened before this? There was another fight between people. You had Yaakov and Esav who were fighting, and that also led to someone leaving their parents. So Yaakov left their parents because of the fight between Yaakov and Esav. And what's the language, it uses there? It's the first word of our parsha, right? Vayetze.
They
Yeah,
say,
and Yaakov went
yeah.
out. And he wasn't just
Mm-hmm.
going out from the land of Canaan, he was also going out from his parents in that same language. So we have this cycle of fight, children being forced to go out, fight, children being forced to go out, fight, children being forced to go out. Um, and it's just like this horrible, terrible cycle, which eventually at the end of Bereshit gets stopped, and Yehuda does what he does to stop it, and Yosef does what he does to stop it.
Yeah, you just have series of fights and leaving, fights and leaving. And again, we can like go through it and mark off who we think is responsible, who we think is collateral damage. But I would say when you have a family like this, and this is your family history, there's a lot of collateral damage in that, right? Like there's a lot of people getting hurt. Um, for sure. So, Ari, this is fascinating. We ended up jumping all over Genesis. I just want to take a minute to pause and think back to what we've seen. So, you showed us these laws in Mishpatim, and we saw that they seem to actually apply to cases in Bereshit, and it seems that the core case is Rachel's death. That seems to be our cornerstone, I would say, right? Like we have a woman who's pregnant who dies in labor, and what we've seen is that death itself is actually part of this larger fight between Lavan and Yaakov. Um, and then we were continuing the implications of that, right? Okay, so if this story in Shemot lines up to the story between Rachel and Yaakov and Lavan, and we're just following through on our cast of characters, Yaakov seems to be the person who is then the person who you would expect to be punished. And what you show me is that actually does come through, that does follow through. Yaakov does seem to be punished, and he seems to be punished in this reciprocal way that lines up with the punishment that we've seen in Shemot. And you show me that this cycle of violence is actually part of the larger story, right? So we have this case in various ways repeating itself. So I'm on board with you for all of that. But I remember you saying that for you, what this really changed was how you see that fight between Lavan and Yaakov. And so I'd love to go back to that.
Right. So for me, what these connections in Parshat Mishpatim made me realize is that this thing where Yaakov says this curse and it ends up leading to the death of Rachel, it's not this isolated thing. It was part of a fight
Hmm.
between two people, neither of whom wanted to hurt Rachel, right? Rachel was
Yeah.
Lavan's beloved daughter and Yaakov's beloved wife. None of them wanted this to happen, but they were fighting. And when two people fight, there's gonna be collateral damage. There's gonna be unintended consequences. That's the nature of conflict and of fights. And I always read this story of this fight as being really one-sided. Lavan's this terrible guy. He's tricking Yaakov constantly. He's abusive. He gaslights him. When Lavan finally tries to leave, Lavan doesn't let him. And so, like, what choice does Yaakov have? Like, of course he has to run away in the middle of the night. How else is he going to get his
Hmm.
family out of there? He seems totally justified. And I think he is. And if I was in Yaakov's shoes, I don't know what else I would have done. But then you could also look at Lavan's side of it, and you could see how heartbroken Lavan was. And he says, "Vatignovat levavi, you've stolen my heart." And however justified one side may be, a fight is a fight. And the way Parshat Mishpatim shows it doesn't say what the fight's about. It doesn't say who started the fight. It says there was a fight, and and not just he hits a woman, they hit a woman, because to a certain extent, like anyone who's involved in this fight is responsible for the damage that is
Yeah.
caused. And this has unintended consequences for Lavan. It has unintended consequences for Yaakov and for Rachel, and even for the next generation, as this cycle of conflict and children getting pulled away from their
Hmm.
parents continues.
That's interesting. So if you just read Genesis without Shemot, one of the things you're saying is Yaakov would look like an innocent victim himself. He would look like someone who's just trying to, do what he can to have freedom. And Lavan's the bad guy. But once you see all these parallels and you're lining up the cast of characters, and it hits you that, oh, Yaakov is not just an innocent player in this. He lines up with one of these two men who's having the fight. And in Shemot, the responsibility lies on both those men. Like we said, only one is punished, but in the language of Nagfu, that plural language, there is a sense that these two people are responsible for this fight. It makes you go back to Genesis and kind of check yourself and say, oh, wait, have I been going too easy on Yaakov? Because the implication in Shemot is that he is partnered with Lavan as one of the fighters. He is not just the innocent bystander in this episode. And so, yeah, I see that does actually really change your lens on Yaakov. You're giving Yaakov a lot more responsibility for the conflict with Lavan.
Yeah, and one of the things I think is so powerful about how the Torah does teach us is does it through this abstract case in Mishpatim. It doesn't say like here's the story of Yaakov and Lavan and here's who was right and who was wrong and here's what they should have done. It says two men are fighting and they strike a pregnant woman. And it lets us think about that case in the abstract. And then we can find these parallels and then apply them to the case of Yaakov and Lavan and learn some things and use that language from the abstraction to deal with a more complicated case. And then we can use all of that and use that to give us language to try to deal with the situations in our own lives. And there's something that is really comforting about how the Torah validates the complexity of it all. And validates that, there isn't always one clear right answer.